This is lecture 62A in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, volume 4 on Oceania, and the chapters on Australia. And we're going to start out quickly with a discussion of the geology of Australia that includes virtually all known rock types and from all geological periods. It spans over 3.8 billion years of the Earth's history. So Australia's geology is divided into several main sections. These are the Archean Cratonic shields, the Proterozoic fold belts and sedimentary basins, the Phanerozoic sedimentary basins, and the Phanerozoic metamorphic and igneous rocks. Australia, as a separate continent, began to form after the breakup of Gondwana in the Permian period. That began with the separation of the continental landmass from the African continent and the Indian subcontinent. Australia then rifted from Antarctica in the Cretaceous. Now, the current Australia continental mass is composed of a thick subcontinental lithosphere over 200 kilometers thick, that's 120 miles, in the western two-thirds, and 100 kilometers thick in the younger eastern third, or 60 miles thick. The Australian continental crust, excluding the thin margins, has an average thickness of 38 kilometers, with a range in thickness from 24 to 59 kilometers. The continental crust is composed primarily of Archean, Proterozoic, and some Paleozoic granites and gneisses. A thin veneer of plainly Phanerozoic sedimentary basins cover much of the Australian landmass, and these are up to 7 kilometers thick. These in turn are currently undergoing erosion by a combination of aeolian and fluvial processes, that is, air and water processes, forming extensive sand dune systems, deep and prolonged development of laterite and saprolite profiles, and development of playa lakes, salt lakes, and ephemeral drainage. The Tertiary period saw the majority of Australian tectonism cease. Examples of intraplate volcanism exist, for instance the Glasshouse Mountains in Queensland. There are tertiary examples of a chain of small volcanic plugs that decrease in age to the south. There they result in 10,000-year-old maar volcanoes and basalts of the newer volcanics in South Australia and Victoria. Pleistocene Alps in Australia do not fit the image of towering, sharply defined peaks and ice-scoured ridges as found in the Himalayas and European Alps. Instead, the Australian Alps comprise extensive undulating plateaus and ridges. These are surrounded by steep slopes, escarpments, and gorges. In New South Wales, much of the undulating plateau landform is still intact, whereas in Victoria there are a number of smaller isolated plateau areas dissected by deep gorges and river valleys. The Australian Alps are not very high by world standards. Mount Cusco is 7,000 feet above sea level, while Mount Bogong, the highest in Victoria, is 6,200 feet, and Mount Bimberi, the highest in the Australian Capital Territory, is less than 6,000 feet above sea level. However, Australia's Alps are remarkable for their age and formation. They are lower than other famous mountain ranges elsewhere in the world because they are older, were formed differently, and have been subject to erosion for a longer period. Now, when we come to the Pleistocene, especially in the last 2 million years, they have been a time of global ice age, with ice caps forming on high ranges around the world, as well as at the poles, known in geology as the Pleistocene epoch. And because the Australian Alps are only of modest height, the highest point being Mount Kosciuszko at 7,000 feet, glaciers were formed only on its very high parts, above 6,240 feet. Several glacially formed tarns filled the bottoms of cirques after the ice melted about 12,000 years ago at Club Lake, Blue Lake, and Headley Tarn. Some of the small valleys near Mount Kosciuszko have U-shaped cross-sections typical of valleys carved by glaciers. However, much of the Australian Alps outside this small glaciated area was affected by the cold conditions during the Pleistocene. This is proven by periglacial features such as block stream, terracing, and frost-shattered boulders, all created by permanent ice and semi-permanent ice in rocks and soil, and these are often called permafrost features. Archaeological evidence from ash deposits in the Coral Sea indicates that fire was already a significant part of the Australian landscape over 100,000 years ago. Over the last 70,000 years, it became more frequent as hunter-gatherers used it to drive game, to produce a green flush of new growth, to attract animals, and to open up impenetrable forest. Dense forest became more sclerophyll forest, open forest became grassland, and fire-tolerant species became more predominant. Dramatic changes to the megafauna, as many disappeared, as did many smaller species. About 60 different vertebrates became extinct. This includes the Diprotodon family of very large marsupial herbivores that look like hippos, and several large flightless birds, carnivorous kangaroos, the 15-foot long snake called Wonambi nacortensis, a 15-foot lizard, and Maolanio that was a tortoise the size of a small car. With no large herbivores to keep the vegetation down and rapidly recycle soil nutrients with their dung, fuel buildup became more rapid and fires burned hotter. This, combined with the seasonal fires of human origin, reduced fuel loads. So the period from 18,000 to 15,000 BP saw increased aridity of the continent, with lower temperatures and less rainfall than currently prevails. Between 16,000 and 14,000 BP, the sea level rose 50 feet in 300 years. And by 13,000 years ago, the Torres Strait connection, the Bassian Plain between modern-day Victoria and Tasmania, and the link from Kangaroo Island began disappearing under the rising sea. Dating is based on a chert deposit in the strait between the island and the mainland, and the use of chert as a predominant rock in the lithic industries of the region. From that time on, the Tasmanian Aborigines were geographically isolated. By 9,000 BP, small islands in Bass Strait, as well as Kangaroo Islands, were no longer inhabited by humans. Pleistocene vertebrate paleontology and the mammalian extinctions. Australia's large animals were 90% extinct by 45,000 years ago. Rigorous biostratigraphic and terrestrial climate record studies threw light on the extinctions. This new light comes from an analysis of faunal data from the Nakorte caves in southeastern Australia, compared with the 500,000 record of local ineffective moisture. Despite significant population fluctuations driven by glacial interglacial cycling, the species composition of the mammal fauna was essentially stable for 500,000 years before the late Pleistocene extinctions. Larger species declined and then recovered during a drier interval between 270,000 and 220,000 years ago, because the speleothem, that is, the cave record, and prior faunal response imply that local conditions should have been favorable for megafauna until at least 30,000 years ago. Climate change is unlikely to have been the only cause of the extinctions. The conclusion among Australian archaeologists is that human arrival contributed to the removal of these large mammals. Now, causality and process. My first paper in archaeology at a professional meeting was New Light on Causality and Process in the Sociocultural Evolution of the Prehistoric Southwest. My mentor at California State College, Los Angeles, now California State University, Los Angeles, was Professor Hal Eberhard, and he was impressed with that paper, so much so that he recommended me to Richard S. McNeish and Richard Forbes for acceptance to their Department of Archaeology graduate school program in Calgary, Alberta. The important thing here is that I introduced the epistemology of dialectical materialism to archaeology at that time and have been promoting it ever since. My intellectual mentor was the greatest archaeologist of the English-speaking world at that time, the Marxist theoretician V. Gordon Childe, who had just died. He had introduced the idea of Neolithic revolution to the world, but had stumbled on the question of primary and secondary causality by concluding that environmental change at the end of the Pleistocene was responsible for the Neolithic Revolution, and I had therefore corrected that error. A dialectical materialist epistemology begins with the premise that the universe is real and independent of human consciousness, that all things are interconnected directly or indirectly, that cause and effect are universal, one leading to the other, and that causation is always primarily to be found within any given phenomena. In Australia, the idea that internal causation is primary in culture change has been adhered to by a number of archaeologists. Professor Harry Lorantos has been prominent in this regard, and the important thing is that Australian colleagues have accepted dialectical materialist epistemology and made it primary in their conceptualization of history. So change in socio-cultural systems always begins at home. External causation in the form of environmental change is always secondary. It is secondary because it is the condition within which primary causation acts. In short, environmental causation is always secondary or conditional, and this is the proper way to resolve any dispute about Australian people and those of New Guinea when confronted with environmental change, such as sea level fluctuations and variation in natural food supply. The evidence supports the idea that sites 4,000 years ago experienced increased usage of some resources because the ability to do so was already in their technological inventory, as for that matter was their social organizational readiness. Primitive communism. The earliest evidence of humans in Australia is paleontological and comes from southeastern Australia, where an increase in fire activity dates from 120,000 years ago, if this does represent human activity. Otherwise, archaeological finds date 65,000 years ago. Now that would have been shortly after the last interglacial of the late Pleistocene, or what in North America we call the Sangamon interglacial. Then sea levels were 300 feet lower than they are today, so people could arrive by sea from New Guinea. They occupied Australia when Tasmania was still joined to the continent. In Arnhem Land, Namalika Nansha, the second rock shelter, dates around 55,000 BP. Many sites dating from 40,000 BP have been excavated near Penrith, a far western suburb of Sydney. Numerous stone tools were found in Cranebrook terraces and gravel sediments with dates of 50,000 to 45,000 years BP. Charles Dortch has identified chert and calcrete flakestone tools found at Rotten Nest Island in Western Australia at 50,000 years ago, and this is consistent with the uranium, thorium, and radiocarbon results for a flint tool found embedded in Tamala limestone. Both mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome studies on the genetic distance of Australian Aboriginal genomes from African and other Eurasian ones ties in nicely. Archaeological evidence indicates human habitation at the upper Swan River of Western Australia by about 40,000 years ago, and radiocarbon dating suggests people lived in and around Sydney for at least 30,000 years. In an archaeological dig in Parramatta, Western Sydney, it was found that the Aboriginal population used charcoal, stone tools, and possible ancient campfires. The continental coastline extended much further into the Timor Sea, and Australia and New Guinea formed a single landmass called Sahul, S-A-H-U-L, connected by an extensive land bridge across the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and Torres Strait. Nevertheless, the sea presented an obstacle, so these ancestral people had to reach Australia by island hopping. One route they followed was the island chain between Sulawesi in Indonesia and New Guinea. The other route reached northwestern Australia via Timor. Both journeys required open ocean travel, making these first Australians among the world's earliest primitive communist mariners. Tasmania, which was connected to the continent by a land bridge, may have been inhabited 60,000 years ago, and was definitely inhabited by 30,000 years ago. As for what prompted their southward movement, I suspect we have several reasons. The first is the most important general reason for human movement out of Africa to begin with. That is the need to dump more labor time. Traveling into unoccupied pristine lands made the use of social time in productive ways less likely to produce a surplus that would inevitably end up differentially in individual hands. And secondly, Scott Kane wrote in 2013 that the first wave might have been prompted by the eruption of Mount Toba. That is, if they arrived around 70,000 years ago and crossed the water from Timor when the sea levels were low. But if they came later, around 50,000 years ago, a more likely route would have been through the Moluccas to New Guinea. Austronesian expansion from southern China to Timor over the last 5,000 years corresponds with the expansion of the Pama-Nyungan language over 7/8 of Australia. The spread of the Australian small tool tradition occurs after 5000 BP. The sharing of animal and plant species between Australia, New Guinea, and nearby Indonesian islands is another consequence of the early land bridges, which closed when sea levels rose with the end of the last glacial period. The sea level stabilized to near its present levels about 6,000 years ago, and flooding the land bridge between Australia and New Guinea. The human genome is being studied in an attempt to distinguish a wave invasion model from a single settlement one. Some Y chromosomal studies indicate a recent influx of Y chromosomes from the Indian subcontinent. A 2012 paper by Alan J. Redd et al. On this topic notes that the divergent times reported correspond with a series of changes in the Australian anthropological record between 5,000 years ago and 3000 BP. This includes the introduction of the dingo. Testing of the mitochondrial DNA of dingoes shows a close connection to the dogs of Eastern Asia and North America. The recent finding of kangaroo ticks on the pariah dogs of Thailand further suggests that this genetic expansion may have been a two-way process. So people accompanied by dogs were going back and forth, at least between Australia and Indochina. There has been long-term contact between Australians of the far north and the Austronesian people of modern-day New Guinea and the Solomon Island. The last 9,000 years witnessed an increase in temperature and rainfall and the development of a sophisticated tribal social structure. The main items of trade were songs and dances, along with flint, precious stones, shells, seeds, spears, food items, and so forth. The Pama-Nyungan language family extends from Cape York to the southwest. It eventually covered all of Australia, except for the southeast and Arnhem Land. There was also a continuity of religious ideas and stories throughout the country. Some song lines crossed from one side of the continent to the other. The initiation of young boys and girls into adult knowledge was marked by ceremony and feasting. Behavior was governed by strict rules regarding responsibilities to and from uncles, aunts, brothers, and sisters, as well as other in-laws. These kinship systems included a division into moieties with restrictions on intermarrying dictated by a person's moiety. Prehistoric Australian culture was animistic and animistic. Every creature and plant had its place within it. Detailed observations of nature were elevated into narrative drama of intricate relationships between these observed phenomena, making these observed phenomena memorable. Tribal, political, and religious power rested with community elders, and later in the simple chiefdoms this continued, and hereditary chiefs did not emerge until ATC times. Disputes were settled communally in accordance with an elaborate system of tribal and chiefdom law, and cremation of the dead was practiced by 25,000 years ago, possibly before anywhere else on Earth. Early artwork of the Cunalda Cave near Larbour Plain date to 20,000 BP. In 1788, there were at least 500,000 people in Australia. This population formed hundreds of distinct and cultural language groups. Most were hunter-gatherers with rich oral histories, and advanced land management practice have been developed by them over thousands of years. In the most fertile and populous areas, people lived in semi-permanent settlements in the fertile Murray Basin, the gathering and hunting economies gave way to fish farming. Along the Murray River, people were practicing agriculture, as proven by large haystacks that were permanent grain stores. In 1770, when Cook first claimed New South Wales for Britain, the native population consisted of 600 distinct tribes speaking between 200 and 250 distinct languages and over 600 distinct dialects and subdialects. Diseases then decimated indigenous populations, being promoted by genocidal practices of the first European settlers before the Aborigines came into direct white contact. The people living along the northern coastline of Australia in the Kimberley, Arnhem Land, Gulf of Carpentaria, and Cape York had encounters with various visitors for many thousands of years before white contact. People traded goods freely between Australia and New Guinea up to and after flooding of the land bridge 6,000 years ago. Trade and intercourse between the separated lands continued across the newly formed Torres Strait, whose 90-mile wide channel remained readily navigable with the chain of Torres Straits Island and reefs affording intermediary stopping points. The islands were settled by different seafaring Melanesian cultures, such as the Torres Strait Islanders, over 2,500 years ago, and cultural interactions continued via this route with the Aboriginal peoples of northeast Australia. For that matter, the Torres Straits are a continuing important financial link between the Queensland Cape York Peninsula and the PNG. This due to the drug trafficking and human smuggling that is a major economic component of modern Australia, as shown in the TV series The Straits on Netflix. Indonesian Bajo fishermen from Banda in the Spice Islands, that is Indonesia, have fished off the coast of Australia for hundreds of years. Moccasin traders from Sulawesi, that is in Indonesia, regularly visited the coast of northern Australia to fish for trepang, an edible sea cucumber. A Chinese market existed for this food since AD 1700, and Tamil seafarers also had knowledge of Australia and Polynesia before white contact. A high degree of cultural exchange is proven in Aboriginal rock and bark paintings, with subject matter including dugout canoes, tobacco and tobacco pipes. There are Moccasin words in Australian languages, for example, Bolanda for white person. There are descendants of Malay people in Australian communities, and vice versa. The myths of the Arnhem Land have preserved accounts of trepang catching, rice growing Maijini people in Australia before the Moccasins. The Maijini were Southeast Asian people, such as Baju visitors to Australia, who visited Arnhem Land before the Moccasins. That is, the Maijini are a mythological reflection of the experience of some Yolngu people who have traveled to Sulawesi with the Moccasins and come back. A small number of copper coins with Arabic inscriptions were discovered on a beach in Jensen Bay on Markenbar Island, part of the Wessel Islands of the Northern Territory. These coins were from the Kilwa Sultanate of East Africa. Only one such coin had ever previously been found outside East Africa, and that had been unearthed during an excavation in Oman. The inscriptions on the Jensen Bay coins identify a ruling sultan of Kilwa, but it is unclear whether that ruler was from the 10th century or the 14th century. This discovery has been of interest to those historians who believe it is likely that people made landfall in Australia or its offshore islands before the first generally accepted such discovery by the Dutch sailor Wilhelm Janszoon in 1606. In conclusion, the first settlement of Australia occurred after the last interglacial, when the first Australians crossed the sea between Sehul and Sunda 70,000 years ago. Sunda and Sehul had a permanent water crossing, meaning that the first Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had to make crossing on the open sea. Sehul is important in that in the past, Australia was not an isolated continent, but was joined with New Guinea and Tasmania. As such, New Guinea has always been the focus of archaeological investigations by Australian researchers. The most important early sites in Australia are Rottnest Island, 70,000 years old, Nawalabila, 55 to 60,000 years old, Malacanunja at 45 to 61,000 years old, Devil's Lair, 45,000 years ago, and Lake Mungo, 45,000 years old. With the settlement of Australia, it is most probable that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people first settled on the northern coast. Afterwards, there were three routes of continental dispersal. The first was a concentric dispersal through the entire continent through one single entry point. The second, a coastal dispersal by spreading along the coastal line and entering inland areas, mainly via the major waterways. And thirdly, fluctuating colonization in and out of different environmental zones. For example, in plentiful years, the population would occupy semi-arid regions, but in drought would move to areas with better resources. And finally, we come to the cultivation question. Kent Flannery's model, adopted by Professor Kotak, is that of the broad-spectrum revolution. This revolution saw foragers exploiting virtually all types of naturally occurring food resources. This ability naturally evolved into managing natural landscapes, harvesting nuts, and broadening their subsistence base outward to include more fish, small game, waterfowl, invertebrates like snails and shellfish, as well as previously ignored or marginal plant sources. This happens everywhere in the world where archaeological sequences lead to Neolithic of band or tribal agricultural revolution. Of course, it happened in Australia to their hunters and gatherers, and internal preparatory change was well established when climatic change, including sea level rises during the Flandrian transgression, conditioned their Neolithic revolution. Conditions became more inviting, first of all, to life offshore in shallow, warm waters. Secondly, river carrying capacity was weakened with rising sea levels, and this created many estuaries. Currents flowing into the ocean were slow enough to allow fish to ascend upstream to spawn. Thirdly, the quantity and variety of marine life increased drastically, as did the number of edible species. And finally, fourthly, birds found refuge next to riverbeds in marsh grasses, and then proceeded to migrate to different habitats. Australian peoples had a good understanding of local ecologies and harvested many varieties of plants and animals in season. W. E. Roth talks about driving kangaroos into a three-sided enclosure of nets with the assistance of numerous beaters. Wallabies and emus were caught in a similar way. Wallaroos were hunted with fire and beaten towards a creek where they were killed with spears and sticks, and animals were driven towards set nets, and fish traps were common. Australian and Torres Strait Islander people practiced agriculture. Australian women in traditional societies often transplanted immature bush tucker plants found growing in unfavorable locations to more favorable spots. And there were also a number of plants, particularly seeds and roots, that could have lent themselves to cultivation and were used in making such foods as damper. Charles Sturt, in his 1844 expedition to northwest New South Wales in central Australia, reports seeing large haystacks built by Aboriginal people of seed crops. This was located east of Depot Glen, Bilparinka, about 350 miles from the Murray River. Fire stick farming was used as a technique to open the canopy of closed canopy forests, introducing sunlight to the ground and prompting germination of a number of foodstuffs known to attract kangaroo and other marsupials. This encouraged a more intensive land use. The main reason for the lack of agriculture in Australia was the main reason propelling people to develop their inherent technological ability to plant crops and pen animals. That is, the extreme variability of the climate. Australia is the only continent on Earth, because of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, that experiences greater variability between years than it does between the seasons. Such climatic variability makes farming difficult but essential. Australian broad-spectrum exploiting people found that maintaining stable populations below the effective carrying capacity of the environment without agriculture was the only way that would enable an adequate supply of food. Where that was unacceptable, people moved forward into agricultural revolution, as the people of Cook in Papua New Guinea from 12,000 years BP. At that time, New Guinea was connected to Australia, so we know crop raising was possible in the Sahul supercontinent when conditions were favorable. And that brings us to a conclusion of our first lecture on Australia. Next we will move into the period after white contact, and of course after that into the growth of the Australian labour movement and lots of stuff about V. Gordon Childe. He started out as an Australian and ended up in England as a professor of prehistory and archaeology. And that takes care of it for today.